The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
All right, guys, I'm gonna get started. If you haven't done attendance yet, you can do it at the break or afterwards. Anything will work. Okay, so just a few quick announcements. So homework 1 is posted and due Friday. I had it up on here. Are there any questions about homework 1 or anything about the procedure? So Lee Marie is going to have office hours shortly after class, 4:30 to 5:30. In E51 145, so if you have any questions, you can ask her as well, or you can ask me now if you think they're applicable to the general class. Okay, cool. So I'm going to proceed then. So I hope, so most of you I think have started playing in the online tournaments. I hope you guys, if you haven't, I hope you plan on starting soon. I hope they've been fun so far. Okay, so today I'm going to focus more specifically on poker itself. I know last class I talked about a lot of general concepts on decision making and how to think about exploiting your opponent versus playing in a Nash equilibrium way. Today I'm going to focus mostly on poker and try to give a lot of hand examples. And I'm going to introduce post-flop play, which I didn't really talk about last time. So basically what happens after you see the flop. Okay, so I'm going to just start with an example hand. So we get ace-queen offsuit in hijack -1. So I think I called it low jack in an earlier slide in last class, but basically it's 4 away from the button. So it's how many people, the thing that matters is how many people behind have cards and could be left to act. So we raise a bit bigger than 2.25 big blinds, but I'm not going to nitpick that for now. So we're a bit deeper stacked, so we want to build a bigger pot because we think we have an advantage, I guess. Okay, so it's folded to both blinds and both blinds call. Okay. So the flop comes 9-8 deuce. So we sort of missed the flop. And the small blind checks and the big blind checks. Okay, so what happened is clear so far? Okay, so now we have a decision here essentially. So first I want to talk about checking to the pre-flop aggressor. So this is sort of a conventional way to play. So they both check. So we were the pre-flop aggressor. So in this case, I mean by pre-flop aggressor, the person who put in the last raise pre-flop. And the reason why this is significant is because in some sense, we have a stronger range of hands than they do. Because we could potentially have pocket aces, which is the best hand, and it's going to be a good hand on pretty much any flop. Whereas it's much harder, it's much more unlikely for them to have pocket aces, because if they had pocket aces, it would be a good play and a tempting play to re-raise pre-flop. So basically, they're sort of just recognizing the fact that, on average, we're going to have a better hand than them, so they're going to check to us and let us bet. Because in general, on average, they would prefer if the pot was smaller, and we would prefer if the pot was bigger, because our range is better. So, so they both check to us, and, right, so let's say they had a pretty good hand. Let's say small blind had 10-9 suited or something, which is the top pair, so the highest pair on this board. That's a pretty good hand, but that's still a hand that loses to pocket aces, and there's still the risk if he bets out with 10-9, we could just raise, and then he has to be worried, do we have pocket aces? There's basically always going to be this worry of pocket aces and pocket kings and just big pairs that he has to worry about that we have to worry about less. Occasionally someone there probably should slow play pocket aces pre-flop and just call, but most of the time it'll be a better idea for them to re-raise to get more money in pre-flop. So that's why they both check to us. So now we have the opportunity to bet or to check back. So let me first talk about how big to bet if we decide to bet. So here we bet 200 into 375, which is about half the pot. And so between betting big and betting small, it's sort of the same principles I talked about last class between raising big and raising small pre-flop. So the advantage of betting small, so the disadvantage of betting small is that you give your opponent better odds to call. So like, let's say they have, I don't know, like Jack 10 here, a hand that's losing to you, they have a better odds to call and a cheaper price to call to see another card to try to beat you. But on the other hand, our hand isn't amazing. Our hand isn't good here, essentially. We've missed the flop. We haven't paired our hand. And if we get raised, we're probably going to have to fold. And the more we bet, the more we lose when we get raised. So it's the same sweet spot principles. If you bet too small, you get called too often by worse hands that can just have good odds to call. And if you bet too big, you're just losing a lot when you get raised. So a good rule of thumb is to bet half the pot on the flop, and then like a slightly bigger percentage on the turn, like 60%, and then an even bigger percentage on the river, like 70% or something. Something like that is about reasonable. You could bet up to like 100% of pot on the river. So I'd say just somewhere between 50 to 100% of pot is a good amount to bet, and the fraction should increase as you get closer to the river. So this might seem slightly contradictory, because what I said last class was, last class I said you don't want to give your opponent great odds. But in some sense, if we get to the river, right, all the cards have come out. There's no more unknown cards. So either they have the better hand or we have the better hand. But there's going to be no uncertainty in what cards could still come. So in some sense, you might think it's more intuitive to bet smaller on the turn and river and bigger on the flop. Because on the flop, they have more chances to outdraw us. Whereas on the turn and river, they have fewer. Let me just find all right, now I don't have to stand there. Okay, so this might seem contradictory, right? So I'm saying bet bigger on the river, but on the river, they actually have, in some sense, it's more determined whether their hand is good or not. So why is this? Why do we want to bet bigger on the turn than the flop, whereas on the flop, any hand sort of has closer to 50% equity, because anything can still happen with two cards to come. So the main reason is because when you bet the flop, they're not just deciding to call your flop bet for the equity there. They also potentially have to call a turn bet and a river bet. And essentially, this factor, the fact that you can threaten to bet again on the turn and bet again on the river, and they have to call all these bets, is a bigger factor than the fact that there's slightly better odds to call on the flop. Okay, so another important thing to say is when I said bet between 50 to 100% of the pot, I mean, I think it's very important to bet at least some fractions of the pot, especially when they're checking to you. Because in some sense, betting small is strictly worse than checking. Like, in this case, you bet 50, which I guess isn't nothing. But imagine you bet $1 here. The issue with this is the rules of betting say, right, if anyone bets any positive amount, then the guys who checked now have a chance to check raise. So if you're betting small, which is almost the same as checking, all you're doing is giving your opponent a free option. You're allowing them the opportunity to say, okay, I could have just, like, if you check, you see the turn, and the turn comes. But by betting, now they have the opportunity, a second chance to bet. Yeah.
How does this change if you have, like, the nuts? Should you bet? Like, you want calls at that point, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. So I'm going to get to that, yeah. So if you have a good hand, yeah, you'll bet too because you want calls. Right now I'm just talking about a general strategy to play with your entire range of hands. And in general, I guess that's how I'm trying to encourage people to think about poker in this class. Like, instead of thinking about what cards do I have and what cards do my opponent have, I try to talk in terms of what is the probability distribution over my opponent's hands and what's the probability distribution over my hands in his eyes, essentially. So I'm just talking about a general scenario, yeah. Okay, cool. So, right, so you never want to bet too small, basically. It's better to just not bet. There's no point to bet really small because you're giving away a free option. Okay, so yeah, so this is what I just said, essentially. Because remember, just because they checked doesn't mean they have bad hands. They're often checking regardless for the reasons I described earlier. Okay, so in this situation with ace-queen offsuit, I think both betting 200 and checking are reasonable plays. And let's analyze the advantages and disadvantages of both. So the advantage of betting 200 is that you don't give some garbage hand like king-jack a chance to outdraw you. So in this situation, if we bet 200, probably if someone had king-jack, they'll probably just fold because it's almost one of the worst hands on this board. And if we bet 200, then they're going to fold, and then we could just win the pot right there. If we don't bet, maybe the turn will come a king or a jack, and they could beat us. So what's the advantage of checking? The advantage of checking is we get to see the turn card for sure. We can't get check raised. Like right now, if we bet and we get check raised, we probably have to fold with no pair. But if we check, we might see a queen or an ace on the turn, which would be great. And another advantage of checking is, in some sense, when you bet in this spot, you're only called by hands that beat you. You know, you're going to get king jack to fold, which is still fine because they have 6 outs, but you are ahead of them. So it's not the end of the world to just check, and you know, if the turn comes like a deuce, you're still ahead. And if it checks all the way to showdown, like all the way to the point where you have to flip over your cards, you're still going to beat king jack. Whereas when you bet, you're essentially getting all the hands you're ahead of to fold. Like if they have ace-7, which you're also ahead of, they're probably going to fold. And pretty much all the hands that beat you probably aren't going to fold. Like maybe someone will fold pocket 3s or something, but for the most part, you're going to get called by a 9, you're going to get called by an 8. So it's this idea of like sort of adverse selection. You're getting called only by hands that beat you, and you're just folding out everything else. So overall, I'd say these about balance out, and you can, I think betting or checking are both fine. Okay, so now let's suppose it's the same spot and we had king-queen. We had king-queen instead of ace-queen. So pretend all the action was the same. All the pre-flop action, the flop action, everything was the same, except just our cards changed. So in this case, if we do the same comparison again, we'll see that betting has a bigger advantage now, because we can get hands like ace-jack and ace-7 to fold. Those hands previously we were beating with ace-queen, but now we don't want to risk getting a situation where it's checked to showdown and everyone flips over their cards and we lose to ace-jack or ace-7. So I'd say in this case, now with king-queen instead of ace-queen, betting has a lot more advantage because we're getting better hands to fold. Okay, and this is what you're talking about. Yeah, what if you have the nuts? So in this case, so suppose now we change our king to a queen, so we actually have a really good hand. We have pocket queens, which is an overpair, a pair above any card on the flop. So now let's look at the advantages of betting versus checking. So now the one advantage of betting that we never had before, because we always had bad hands, is now we can get worse hands to call us. If they have 10-9 or ace-8 or pocket 5s, they're probably going to call, and we're beating them, so we're just going to win more money. And the advantage of checking is essentially none. So the correct play, I think, is clearly to bet in this situation. So essentially what I'm trying to get at is, so I call this the fundamental theorem of poker. It's sort of a made-up term. But essentially, so one of the main things you should realize when you're betting post-flop is a bet basically accomplishes one of two things. So with your good hands, you want to bet because you can get them to call with worse but still good hands. And we call this value betting. So with the pocket queens, this is what you're doing is value betting when you bet. And then with the bottom hands in your range, you should bet to get them to fold better, but still pretty weak hands. So in this case, when we had king-queen, we would be betting to get them to fold ace-jack. So this is called bluffing. So essentially, the point of a bet should either be a value bet because you have a really good hand, or a bluff because you have a really bad hand. And you want to sort of think in terms of that way. And you know, if you ever find yourself making a bet and you're not sure whether it's a value bet or a bluff, then chances are you maybe shouldn't be betting. So with the middle hands in your range, you should check, because if you bet, you fold out all the weaker hands and you keep in all the stronger hands. Okay, does that make sense? So this is like the fundamental concept in poker, essentially, that we should try to realize. Okay, so I sort of made this diagram. So the best hands are at the top of the rectangles, the worst hands are at the bottom. So once again, we're thinking in terms of our entire range of possibilities. So post-flop, we want to so that's on the left. Post-flop, we want to bet the best hands, bluff the worst hands, and then check things in the middle. And then pre-flop, basically we fold all the bad hands, and then we raise, or if someone's already raised, we re-raise the best hands, and we just raise the pretty good hands. I'll talk more about pre-flop in a future lecture. But I just wanted to contrast this because I don't want someone to think, you know, if I have 7-2 offsuit pre-flop, I should be bluffing. Because it's a different scenario, because pre-flop you're choosing what percentage of hands to play, and it's strictly better to just choose the best 30% or the best 40% instead of choosing the best 10% and the worst 10%. Okay, so going back to this principle, with 7-7, so it's still the same situation. So I'm analyzing the same situation many, many times with different cards. With 7-7, the right play is definitely to check. Because, so with ace-queen, it's in a similar spot to ace-queen in that it's also, you get called only by better hands and you mostly only fold out worse hands. But with ace-queen, at least there was the advantage that if they called with like an 8 or a 9, we could turn, we have more chances to beat them. We could turn an ace or a queen and win more money, or alternatively, we could like turn a jack, which gives us a straight draw, and try to bluff them off of their 8 or something. Whereas with pocket 7s, there's less room to play. So I think with pocket 7s, you should definitely check on this flop. So some other stuff about continuation betting on flops. I wouldn't bluff super scary flops. By super scary, I essentially, mathematically, it just means there's a lot of uncertainty because so many things are possible. And basically this happens when there's 3 cards of the same suit and they're all connected. So whenever the board is like this, it looks scary, it looks very coordinated, but mathematically speaking, it's essentially saying anything can happen and no one should fold if you have anything at all. Because, if you have any 10, you have a chance of making a straight. If you have a reasonable heart, you have a chance of making a flush. Just any hand is going to have a reasonable chance. Same as, even if you have like an ace, like I guess as we do, you have a chance of turning a higher pair. So I would just check and basically give up on this flop, or check and hope you hit an ace or a queen, I guess. And another thing is continuation betting into too many people if you have nothing. It can be an advanced play in certain situations if everyone else also recognizes that, if you're continuation betting into 5 people, you must have such a good hand that they're going to fold a hand as good as, say, like pocket 8s here. But for the most part, in practice, I would say if the pot has like 6 or 7 people, I wouldn't try to bet on the flop with overcards to try to get everyone to fold, because someone's going to have 2 hearts, or someone's going to have a 7, someone's going to have a pair. Okay, so I talked about sort of when you want to bet post-flop. So now I'll talk a bit more about when you want to call bets post-flop. And I'm going to try to give a lot of different situations. So now let's look at calling bets. And I think newer players especially tend to call with hands weaker than you need to. So the general rule of thumb is, unless your opponent bets extremely small, which they should not do by what I explained, you should fold most of your hands to a half pot bet. So in some sense, most hands miss most flops, and when you miss, there's really not a reason to do anything other than to fold. There's a lot of tournaments. You can always play the next tournament and get dealt a new hand and try to have a good hand. So, so now I'm going to change the situation up a bit. But once again, I'm going to analyze the same betting situation over different hands. So now it's everyone folds to the button. We're still 40 bets deep because the blinds are 25-50 and we have 2,000. And so the button makes it 125, and we decide to call with our hand. Okay, so let's say we have queen 9 suited in this case, and okay, let's say the flop is 10-7-2. So we check as a form of respect to the pre-flop raiser, and then they bet half pot. So here, this is a situation where, we've got no pair, no draw. I guess we have an overcard. We have an overcard in the queen, and we can turn a pair of queens to beat his pair of 10s, but that's only 3 cards that help us. Basically, the correct play is just to fold. You essentially have nothing here. You have some speculative straight draws where if you hit a jack and then an 8, like if you have 2 cards that come for you, then you can hit a straight. But for the most part, we've got nothing. We just fold. Here are some other situations where you should just fold. So here we have ace high, but the board has 3 pretty big cards, and there's a decent chance he's going to have one of them. And if he doesn't, he's going to have like queen 10 or 10-9 or something with straight, or some kind of straight draw with a lot of outs. So there's just no reason to play hands like these. So it's totally fine if you lose a lot of hands, as long as you win more chips on the hands that you do win. So just fold this, not much reason to play. Here you have, this board is a bit better for you. You have ace 9 high on a 6 high board, but there's a lot of straight draws, and there is a flush draw, a spade flush draw on this board, so I would still fold. Here we even have a pair, but this is an example where I think I'd fold even though you have a pair. So we have a pair of nines here, which is decent, but once again, there's 3 hearts, and it's easy for him to make a flush or make a straight. And even if he doesn't, we're gonna have to check to him on the turn, check to him on the river, and then they can bet, and then we have to decide whether to call or not. So just overall, it's gonna be tough to play. And this is what I'm talking about being out of position. So we have to act first on every street. So it's going to be tougher to make good decisions. Okay, so now we're getting some better hands, but I think I would advocate still folding these. So here our hand it's not bad. We basically got a 4-out straight draw, which is usually called a gut shot. You need to hit an 8 to turn a straight. And also we've got diamonds. If we hit 2 diamonds in a row, we can make a flush. But overall in this spot, I would still fold just because even though we've got 4 outs to our gut shot, we've got no combinations. We've got no other combinations to help us. Like a 9 is essentially useless when there's 3 higher cards on the board. Turning a 9 doesn't help us at all. Turning a 7 doesn't help us at all. And furthermore, even if we turn an 8, it's possible. So if we turn an 8, then Queen 9 makes a better straight than us, and also King Queen, which already has a straight, is a better straight than us. So even when we hit an 8, we're not even 100% sure we're going to win the hand, and we could just put our chips in after hitting an 8 and lose all our chips. So I would fold this as well. 4-out gut shot is pretty bad unless you have other stuff to go with it. Okay, so in this case, we have a better straight draw. So in this case, we have an 8-out straight draw because an 8 gives us a straight, 8 through Queen, but a King also gives us a straight. We have 9 through King. But in this case, I would still recommend folding just because if a King comes, then we do have a straight, but we lose to any ace. So 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace is going to just be a higher straight than our 9 through King straight. So even though we have a lot of outs, the outs aren't that good, and it's possible once again, we make a second best hand, which is the worst possible situation in poker because you're going to put a lot of money in and you're going to lose. Okay, so this is another example I would fold. Pocket 5s on Queen, Jack, 10. You have a small pair. You started with a small pair, but you didn't improve at all. The flop did not help your hand at all, and it most likely helped your opponent's hand. Okay, so here's a question you can ask. So in all these spots I say fold, but what if I think bluff raising will work? What if I think I can get him to fold if I raise? So what I want to say is when you're bluffing on the flop, it's usually because you have some kind of draw or some kind of nice speculative hand that has a chance of turning into a good hand. And all the examples I showed, not only are our hands bad, there's not that many good cards for us, with the exception of maybe the 7-9 hand, where if you turn an 8, it's pretty good. But yeah, even this hand, if you turn an 8, it's not that good because the board is then going to be 8, 10, Jack, Queen. So we're only playing with a 1-card street, which is still fairly easy to put us on. Okay, so before I get to spots where maybe we want to raise, potentially bluff raise, let me just go through some spots where I think calling is a pretty good play. So here, I think calling with ace-9 high on this board is reasonable. In the example where I said you should fold, the flop was 6-5-4, and there was a flush draw. So there were straight draws and flush draws. In this case, the board is paired, which really helps us because there's just fewer combinations of pairs that he can make. And a 3 is a pretty small card, so it's pretty unlikely they have a 3. So ace-9 high is pretty good here. You have 2 overcards. You even have a diamond backdoor flush draw. So I would call here. Okay, so so getting better here. This hand is even better. We have ace-3. We have bottom pair on this pretty safe flop. It is 3 different cards, and they could have a jack or a 5, but just overall against their range, we have tremendous equity here. So I would call. So note when I say call, not raise. I'll give you examples of how good, roughly speaking, our hand has to be to raise. All right, so here I would call. The board is very scary, but we have second pair, and I think second pair is just second pair with the best kicker, the ace. So that's definitely good enough to call. With ace-9, I think this would be borderline whether you call. I think calling is okay, but not mandatory. Okay, Here's another example, second pair on a safer board. This is a pretty good hand. I mean, if they've got an ace, we're not drawing to that many outs, but if they don't have an ace, they're not drawing to that many outs. So it's because whenever big cards come on the flop, like an ace and a king, in some sense, even if there's flush and straight draws, more of who's going to win has been decided. Because if you've got a big pair, like if you've got an ace or a king, then there's not like an even bigger card that can come on the turn to beat you. And if you don't have it, then you know, it's like if you have 10-9, even if you turn it 10, you're not going to outdraw ace-7. So here I would just call. Here you have a pretty good pair, pocket eights on 9-3-3. You have a very good hand here, but I just think in this case where there's no flush draws, no straight draws, there's not really that much reason to raise, because it's not like you're going to get called by worse hands that often, that I would still only call, even though in some sense your hand is very, very strong here. Like I would expect you to have the better hand more than 80% of the time, but the problem is when you raise, they're only playing the 20% that beats you, which is hands with 9s, hands with 3s, and like pocket 10s plus. So here I would also recommend calling, even though we have top pair. So top pair, the highest pair on the board. It's a pair of aces, which seems, it seems like we have a good hand we should raise. But once again, our other card, which is very relevant, is very small in this case. So we're going to lose to ace queen, any kind of big ace. And furthermore, there's not that much reason to raise, because we're not that scared of letting him see a turn card with, say, 10-9. Because even if he turns a 10 or a 9, he's not going to beat us. So the reason to raise is essentially to not let your opponent see more cards and give them outs, but they don't have that many outs if we're ahead of them. So this is, you can say this is like a way ahead, way behind situation. That's some terminology that you might hear, which basically means you're either way ahead because they don't have an ace, or you're way behind because they've got ace queen. And when you're way ahead or way behind, you don't really want to be raising, because he's just going to call you when you're way behind, and he's just going to fold when you're way ahead. Okay, so here we're getting into some pretty good hands. Ace-Jack on Jack-10-9 with the flush draw. I think if you raise, it wouldn't be the end of the world. The issue is I think 2,000 chips when the blinds were only 25-50 is still a bit much to put in your entire stack on this flop. And just because even though you have top pair with the best kicker, there's a lot of straights, and even if let's say they have like queen 9 of hearts, a hand that's behind of you currently because they only have a pair of 9s, there's just going to be so many straight and flush outs they're going to have that you're never really getting it in ahead of equity by that much. So I would just call and see what the turn is. But that's maybe one of the examples of the strongest hands you can have where I would still recommend calling. In this case, we've got a small overpair, but I would still call, even though once again we have the best hand probably 80% plus of the time. But once again, when you raise, you're only getting played back at by the 20% that beats you. So, okay, yeah, and notice there, when I went through these examples, the stack size was very important, right? So from the first class, the important things are position, stack size, and cards. In this case, the position was the button. The cards, I've showed you what the cards are. But the stack size, the fact that you're playing for potentially 2,000 chips is very important. And if you're playing for fewer chips, then you can risk gambling a lot more, as I'll show you later. Okay, so another note is you could argue for check raising in some of these call situations, especially the ones where your hand was more vulnerable to overcards. So let me just quickly run through them again. So I'll describe what they are. So this is one of them. Because here you could argue, okay, I want to raise because if I call, what if he has Jack 10? Then he has 6 outs, right? Here, this is another example. What if they have 10-9? They can turn a 10 or a 9 and beat us. Here, this is not an example. Here, I think calling is clearly correct because the only bad cards are like a queen because an ace gives you 2 pairs. So there's just very few scary. The board is already scary and there's not that many overcards that could come. This is another example because in this case there's actually no scary cards in some sense. No card that you're afraid of giving him. This is an example where you could argue for raising. You don't want Jack 10 to see another card. That's reasonable, yeah. Here, there's no risk. It's completely safe, so I would never raise. Here, I guess there are some bad cards, but if you raise, they can just call with their draws anyway to try to hit. So here, this is an example where you could argue for raising to not let them see a turn card. Okay, so yeah, these are reasonable arguments, and I think raising some of these call hands would not be a terrible play. But I think for most of these, the advantages of calling still outweigh the advantages of raising, especially if your opponent is also capable of bluffing. Because, like, let's say you check raise. So let's say they make it 150, you make it 400, and then let's say they go all in. But they're going to go all in not only with hands that beat you, like pocket sevens plus. They'll also occasionally do this with hands like ace 3 or ace 4, hands that have an overcard in the ace but also have a gut shot straight draw, like ace 3 or ace 4 can make a straight. Then you're just in a very tough spot. Basically, if you call, you're not in a good situation because you're often behind. But if you fold, then you're also folding to a lot of weaker hands. So there's just a lot of ways for the hand to go badly if you raise, because your hand sort of, it's not good enough to raise and call if they re-raise, yet it's too good to sort of waste as a check raise bluff and just like fold if they re-raise, right? Like let's say my plan here with pocket sixes is to check raise and fold if they do anything else. But then, like, you could argue, why am I doing this with a hand as good as pocket sixes? Why don't I do this with 10-9? Because it's going to be a similar result most of the time. They're going to either fold, and I'm going to win the pot with 10-9, or they're going to raise, and I'm going to have to fold with 10-9. Occasionally, they'll call, but you could argue in that case, I would almost rather have 10-9 than pocket sixes, because pocket sixes, I'm just going to always lose, and 10-9, who knows, I can turn a 10. So, anyway, so the long story short is I would just recommend just calling with most of those hands, although there's definitely lots of arguments you can make for raising. Yeah.
I didn't get why wouldn't you want to re-raise if you have the top pair and the top kicker? Because if you give them the draws, at least you want to make the pot bigger than it is right now, right?
You're talking about this situation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that the main reason is just your overall equity against their range is pretty low on this board compared to an average situation if you have top pair, top kicker. Like if the board is Jack 7-2, your equity against their range is probably something like 85%. Whereas on this board, your equity is just overall a lot less. There's a lot more hands that beat you, so there's a lot higher probability that if you raise and call and put all your money in, that you're behind, basically. So there's just a huge risk of that. So, but yeah, I do agree. It does feel very unsatisfying to only call and let them see those cards, but I think it's sort of the lesser of two evils in this situation between putting all your money in with this hand versus letting them see some cards. Yeah. All right, cool. Okay, so just how good does my hand have to be to raise? And the question depends on the effective stack size. But when the effective stack size is fairly deep, so let's say 40 big blinds, I think is about 40 big blinds or deeper. So you have a lot of chips, you're playing for a lot of chips relative to the blinds. You need a pretty good hand to want to put all your money in. So a general rule of thumb is 2 pair or bigger. And yeah, once again, this is only applicable when the effective stack size is large. And a lot of the online tournaments, especially the ones where the blinds go up quickly, the effective stack size can be around 10 or even lower pretty quickly. Yeah.
How much do all these decisions depend on their position or your position?
Okay, that's a very good question, actually. Right. So in this situation, so the answer is essentially, yeah, it depends a lot. The examples I gave are specifically for the button. Yeah, so I would say if they were under the gun instead of the button, you need to play somewhat differently because they're going to have, because on the button, they're going to have 55% of hands, and let's say here, like 10-9 is a possibility. But actually, maybe a better example is, I think this is a board where it's really different because if they raise from the button, they could have 55% of hands, and ace 3 is a pretty good hand here. But if they raise from under the gun and they're pretty tight and their ranges pocket 8s or better and ace queen, ace jack, ace king, then you're doing a lot worse. Yeah. Yeah, so it definitely matters a lot, and yeah, I mean, so I guess I can't go through every single possibility, right? Like this position, this stack size with this, so you do have to do a bit of extrapolation. Like if they're right now in these examples, they're the button. If they're the cutoff, their range is going to be a bit stronger. If they're the hijack, their range will be a bit stronger. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, very, very good point. Yeah, because in all the analysis I just did, I'm assuming their range includes hands as bad as like 8-7 suited and stuff, which isn't going to be the case if they were earlier positioned. Okay, so, all right, so how good does my hand have to be to raise? So 2 pair or better, but by 2 pair or better, I mean 2 pair where both of your cards make a pair. Here, where 1 pair is on the flop, I wouldn't count this as 2 pair. And this 2 pair is complete trash because any card beats you, so I wouldn't go on here. This one's also pretty bad. So okay, so now when would we raise? Okay, so I think this is basically the best thing that can happen to you in poker, pretty much. Almost this exact situation. So here we've got we got 3 of a kind, and there's also a lot of draws, so we're going to get played back at a decent amount because he could have hearts, he could have like queen jack. There's just so much stuff that isn't going to fold, and we're always going to be way ahead, pretty much always going to be way ahead. So yeah, I actually think this is very close to the dream situation. Does anyone have an idea why this situation is almost in some sense even better than, say, we had pocket 10s? Yeah.
If you have pocket 10, he's less likely to have a 10.
Exactly. Okay. All right, I'm gonna give you a $20 gift. No more playoffs today, so you can see. Okay. Right. So it's almost even better in some sense. You have pocket 5s because, as Ben said, if you have pocket 5s, he could have a 10 and put in a lot of money. If you have pocket 10s, even though you're crushing even harder, it's almost like you've taken all the good cards away, and he's just always gonna fold. So, okay. Here's another situation where your hand's very good, although I think you can make a case for just calling here. Yeah, I don't want to say you have to raise because your hand is just so invulnerable, and even though the chances that he has the remaining ace and a better card to go with it is pretty small, there is still a lot of, I guess, like adverse selection in this case where, because there's no draws, when you raise, he will fold a lot of stuff, and the stuff that he does play, it's not going to only include the remaining ace. Like he will call with pocket 7s almost certainly, but it does include it does significantly make his range more likely to be the ace that beats you. So I think just calling is okay. Here, obviously, you have the best possible hand. Although once again, I think just calling as a sort of a trap is reasonable. Although I would advocate just raising. I think it's the simpler play. Calling, I think you'll see a lot of high stakes players do as a trap, but it's a very, very tricky play. I think raising definitely has lots of merits because, like, if they've got king, like even ace king, they're not going to fold. They just want to get all the money in because they're probably going to think you're more likely to have a single heart than 2 hearts. So if they have ace king, especially when it's only 40 big blinds, they're probably just going to be happy putting all the money in, and before you can see a 4th heart. So, like in this case, even though you don't need a 4th card to make a flush, a 4th card is a really bad card for you because that sort of kills all the action you're getting from a king, from a pair of kings or something. Yeah. Okay, so this is a similar situation, although in this case I would say a raise is mandatory. In the previous case, I think it's not mandatory because your hand is so safe. If you decide to try to trap your opponent, you'll never end up trapping yourself. Whereas here, if they just have any heart higher than a 6, if a 4th heart comes, they're beating you now. And worst of all is, let's say they have 10 of hearts, 9 of diamonds. If you raise, you could have easily gotten them to fold that 10 of hearts probably. Although 10 of hearts, 9 of diamonds is a bit good. Let's say like 9 of hearts, 8 of diamonds. They almost certainly would have folded their higher heart. And now you just lost an entire pot because you didn't raise. So here I would raise. You have a straight. You are drawing dead if they have a flush, but with only 40 big blinds, I think the chances of a flush is unlikely enough. Getting it in is okay. With 100 big blinds, you could still raise, but probably not go all in. 2 pair. The board is sort of scary, but 2 pair is definitely good enough here. So All right, so these are examples where you had really good hands, and I said you should just raise and get the money in and be happy about it. So do I need such a good hand? There's some other situations where a one-pair hand is sort of good enough. And so coming back to the ace-jack example you asked, so we'll see some of that. Okay, so in this case, I think if you have pocket aces, that's definitely good enough to get it in, although you shouldn't have pocket aces that often here because most of the time you should be re-raising pre-flop. But you know, if you decide not to raise pocket aces pre-flop and you end up with it here, then I guess raising is good. You're going to be having the better hand. Although, you know, if you were trapping them pre-flop, maybe you just want to trap them again and call again, since there's not that many scary cards. So here's an example of an ace-jack situation where I think getting in is fine, just because there's still draws and there's still lots of worse hands that will give you action, but overall your equity against their range is much, much higher on Jack 7 deuce than Jack 10 9. So I would just raise and be happy getting in 40 big blinds here. Here's a similar example, King Jack, but we've also got the second best flush draw, so it's just very hard to get it in bad. Okay, so we'll see some examples where we have fewer chips. So in the last case, all the hands, we essentially had 40 big blinds, essentially had a lot of chips. So now let's look at a situation where all the players, so we only have 1250 to start the hand. So that's 25 big blinds. And, okay, so in this case, even if you got top pair with a mediocre kicker, I would just be prepared to go all in because we were risking a lot fewer chips. We're risking a lot fewer chips relative to the blinds. So here I would just go all in. So here are some, so I'm showing you some examples where, you know, if I'm 40 or more big blinds deep, I wouldn't be happy getting all my money in. But when I'm only 25 big blinds deep, I'm very happy to get all my money in. This is another example, top pair, top kicker. It is a scary board in some sense, but you just got to gamble for it when the pot is already so big on the flop relative to your stack. Same thing again here. So earlier I had some examples of this similar to this where I said you just call, but when you've only got 4 to 5 times the flop, 4 to 5 times the pot on the flop, I would just go for it. Okay, I'll quickly run through this session. This section. This is a slightly more advanced play where you don't check to the pre-flop raiser. So this whole time I've been talking about checking to the pre-flop raiser as a form of respect, respecting that the pre-flop raiser's range contains aces and yours probably doesn't. So when do we want to lead? So from a theoretical point of view, so from a trying to play optimally point of view, essentially we want to lead flops that hit our range better than his, even though his range contains aces, which is like a universal best hand. So they're rare, but they do exist. And I think it's okay if you never lead, but I'm going to quickly run through this section, showing some examples where I think leading is fine. But I think it's an advanced, unnecessary play. So, okay, so here's an example. I hope this is visible. So we're pretty shallow here. So most of the situations where leading is good, you're fairly shallow. So cut off one from the button makes it 1200 at 300, 600, and there's antes. So we call with 9 deuce suited with 4.5 to 1 odds. Okay, so here we flop 2, 5, 6, and I lead a third of pot, planning essentially to get all my money in. Because we're so shallow. Like I only started the hand with 10 big blinds. Essentially any pair is going to be good enough to get all my money in. Although maybe not if he raised from under the gun. But from cutoff, I'm happy to put all my money in against this. So what's the rationale? So our hand's good enough to put all our money in, and it's essentially a better flop for our range because we're short enough where the immediate equity pre-flop means so much to us that we're calling a very wide range of hands. Basically, a lot of hands that includes 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s, whereas his range, he opened from button, he opened from cutoff, you know, even though it contains more monstrous hands than ours, like pocket aces, it also just contains a lot of hands like Jack 10, Queen 10, basically hands that don't connect with this board, because if he had 6-5, he probably isn't going to open. At least I don't think by my recommendations he should be opening 6-5, whereas we can have hands like 6-5, we can have hands like 4-3. So I lead here. So it's basically essentially saying, you know, I'm no longer respecting you because the flop came in a very specific way where now my range of hands is actually better than your range of hands. So I'm essentially the pre-flop aggressor, and I'm going to bet and try to make the pot big and force you into a tough situation with your weaker range. And yeah, and we can play like this with our good hands and with our bad hands, like 7-3. We have a gut shot, but we can bluff with it. So here's another example. So under the gun raises, we call with ace-9 suited, which I think is a bit speculative, but whatever. We decide to call, and we lead a 10-7-5 flop where we have a flush draw. And once again, I think it's reasonable. So it's deep. It's fairly deep, but we can have, even though they can have aces, we can have more hands like we can have more pocket 5s, pocket 7s type hands than him who might not open those. And also, he almost certainly isn't ever going to have 9-8 of diamonds or Jack 9 of diamonds, hands that are basically monstrous draws, whereas we can. So once again, I bet because I don't really want him to check back ace king or pocket 8s or something, which he probably will, because you know if they have ace king, they're going to think the board is fairly scary. They're probably not going to fold that much because there's so many draws if I bet. So they're just going to check back ace king. And that essentially has two problems. Is we're not beating ace king unless we improve. So by betting, we just make the pot bigger against ace king and 9s, and we can get them to fold. Whereas if we check, it might just get checked down. And yeah, so yeah, one caveat about leading though is if your opponent knows leading is part of your strategy, then your range is significantly weaker when you actually check. So as a result, if your opponent knows you're the type of player who, let's say on a, so this is really getting next level, but if they know that you're the type of player who will lead a lot of your hands on a 2-5-6 flop in this specific situation, then when you check to them with a hand like Jack 10, they can basically just bet and know you'll almost certainly fold because you're leading a lot of your good hands. So that's another caveat about leading. It's very tricky to balance correctly because you need to, if you're leading bluffs, you need to also lead some good hands to balance it out, but then you also need to check some good hands occasionally to balance out all the bad hands you're checking so that your opponent can't just bet for free. So it's a very tricky play. I wanted to quickly run through it to just say it's out there, and, when you watch poker and you see people not automatically check to the pre-flop aggressor, sort of give you an idea of why. But it is a fairly advanced and tricky play, and it's easy to make mistakes leading, which is why I think, I think it's fine if throughout this course you never lead. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some implied odds and reverse implied odds. So here's the situation. So note that, so we have the worst hand in poker. We've got but we've only got 3 big blinds, okay? And hijack raises to 2,400. So the question is, do we want to call in this situation? So we're putting in 1,600. So we can do a quick equity calculation. So if we call, we're all in. So the only thing that matters is the equity of our hand against his range. That's essentially the only thing that matters. Because he has no more decisions. So optimal play doesn't even matter in this case. It's a strict mathematical expectation calculation. And we're actually, so we need to call 2 big blinds. So 1,600, that's 2 big blinds to win how much is already in the pot. Is 5.5, right? 5.5 big blinds. So they made a big raise here. They made it 3x. So we need 2 over 7.5, which is 27% equity. And if we put them on a reasonable range from that position, we have 28% equity, which is enough to call. So I think calling is a fine play. Okay, I'm not making fun of this person, who I think probably was me. So yeah, calling is a fine play. And so now, but I want to emphasize, okay, so if calling is a good play because it's positive expectancy, why don't we call when we have more chips? So in this situation, if someone called, they would probably be ridiculed, right? Why are you calling with 2-7 offsuit against a hijack raise that isn't even giving you good odds? Because they raised it 3x, which is a big raise. So why is it bad in this case when you have more chips? And the reason is essentially what's called reverse implied odds. So in the first situation, we called because we were all in and the equity calculation said we could. But in the second situation, even though the equity calculation is the same and we do have the right odds to call pre-flop, the hand isn't over. There's still potentially 46,000 more chips to be put in post-flop. And with a hand like 7 deuce offsuit, it's not only is it a weak hand, it's very hard to play. When we hit a pair, we hit a small pair. We're often not going to be sure whether we have the better hand. We're going to have to decide whether to fold or call him down, and we're often going to be wrong. So it's a very, very easy fold in this situation, even though you have the odds, because these reverse implied odds hurt you so much when there's still potentially 46,000 to play for post-flop. Okay, so here, let's say instead of 7-2 offsuit, I had ace-2 offsuit. I would still fold. So if you do the same equity calculation, we actually have 43% against his range, which is tremendous. But you only need 27% equity to all in, right? So why would we fold when we have 43% equity and we only need 27% equity? And the reason is because, once again, reverse implied odds. So there used to actually be this way you could cheat in online poker. So they had this thing called disconnect protection, which is if someone disconnects, this is really stupid. And I got cheated by this so many times. Basically, if you disconnected, instead of your hand getting folded, essentially there's no more betting and all the cards are dealt, and the person who wins the hand just wins the pot. Okay, so essentially by disconnecting, you could say, okay, screw you, there's no more betting, we're just going to see until the river, and whoever wins the hand is going to win the whole pot. So basically you could cheat in this situation, even if you had 7-2 offsuit, by just calling and then disconnecting immediately, and then none of this reverse implied odds exist. But you can't cheat like this anymore, so don't try to make that play. So yeah, so in this case, even though you have 43% equity, I would fold. Here with 9-8 suited, it's a whole different story. We only have 37% equity, which is worse than 43%, but I would call. With 9-8 suited, you can make a flush and make a better hand than him. You can make a straight and get him to put in a lot of money with a good pair. And yeah, you're still out of position. You still have to act second, but overall, it's just a much better situation. Okay, so now I want to talk about implied odds. So with the 9-8 suited, I sort of talked about it's the implied odds. The fact that you still have to play for more chips after on the turn and river almost works in your favor, because you can make straights and flushes and have a very good hand and be fairly certain you're winning and get him to put in more money with a worse hand. So implied odds is basically, it's when the odds are in your favor because you're playing a hand that plays well post flop. Okay, so let's look at an example where implied odds I think are good. So this is called set mining. This is a play that's, so I'm going to go through it even though it's a play that's sort of dying in poker. I think it's a play that no longer works that well in practice nowadays, at least at at fairly high stakes. But it's, in theory, I think it teaches you a very good thing about implied odds. So in this case, under the gun raises to 3x. 2,400 when the blinds are 400, 800, and we decide to call. So if you do the calculation, we don't have enough equity to call, but why do we call? So essentially we're in position because we have the button, and also we can win essentially a huge pot when we hit a third deuce. So now this only happens a small percent of the time. If you do the calculation, this happens roughly 1/8 of the time. You're going to hit a third deuce 1/8 of the time. And essentially when you don't hit a deuce, you're against an under the gun raise. So he's going to have a really strong range. You're going to lose the pot 7/8 of the time, essentially, roughly speaking. So what this is essentially saying is, if I'm only winning the pot 1/8 of the time, I need to win on average 8 times as much as I lose for it to be worth it, right? But the point is, at least back in the day in poker, you essentially do. Because when you do hit the deuce, they're going to have pocket aces or pocket kings, or, the flop will come ace 6-2 and they'll have ace king. They'll just have a tremendously good hand that's still crushed by your hand so often that you definitely, essentially 1/8 of the time you lose 2,400 chips, and 7/8 of the time you lose 2,400 chips, and 1/8 of the time you win their whole stack of 80,000 chips. Essentially is what the best situation is. So, yeah, so you need a lot of chips for this to be a good play. Even if you have 40 big blinds, which is by our standards fairly deep, it's still not that good because once again, you only win 1/8 of the time. So you really need to win a lot when you win. And when you hit a 2, it's not 100% sure that he's going to put in all his money. So basically, you're only winning a huge pot even less than 1/8. Like you need to hit a 2 and you need them to have aces or kings. So that's going to be like 1/20th or whatever. But the point is, if if the stack is so deep, then it's still worth it, is essentially. And the reason why it's sort of dying in poker is because I think, nowadays players are good enough where even if they have aces under the gun, sort of they realize the optimal strategy isn't to always put all your money in on a 7-5-2 flop. But yeah, long story short, I think this is a fine play. I think it's fine if you do it in the current league because it's tough to fold aces on a 7-5 deuce flop. And yeah, I think it's a good play to know about at least. So here's another hand. So cutoff raises to 2,000. We have Jack 10 suited on the button. So once again, we don't have direct odds to call, but we have good implied odds because we're in position and we've got a suited connected hand. Okay, so I'm going to go through the whole hand because there's going to be more examples of implied odds here. So both blinds fold and the pre-flop aggressor, the cutoff continuation bets about a bit less than half of pot. And we have a flush draw here. So what is the effective stack size? Even though we started the hand with 80,000, they only started the hand with 30,000. So the effective stack size is only 30,000. So we're definitely not folding. We could call or we could raise. The problem with raising is when we raise and they go all in, we're sort of in a really crappy situation where our hand's too good to really want to fold, but too weak to have the odds to call is all in. So I think just calling is the right play. And yeah, and raising gives him the opportunity to re-raise all in. If we call, he can't say, oh, guess what, now I'm putting in more chips, right? So, okay, so we miss on the turn, which kind of sucks, and they bet fairly big. They bet 8,000 into 12,000. So let's do an analysis. So, okay, so a simplifying assumption, let's assume they have it, okay? Let's assume we model them as fairly tight. When they're making this bet, they've got us beat. We're not going to win the hand by rivering a jack or a 10. We need to river a diamond. So essentially, let's assume they just have ace king, or they're going to have a pair of aces at least. So we need to call 8,000 to win 20,000 in the pot. So we need 8 over 28, or 29% equity. And if you count, there's 9 diamonds out of 46 cards. So we only have 20% equity, and we need 29% equity. But I would still call. So because when we call and we hit our flush, we can bet on the river, and there's a decent chance that we're going to get called. Whereas if we call and we miss our flush, we can just happily fold. Does that make sense to everyone? So we don't really have the odds to call here, but we call because we can, if we hit our diamond, we can go all in on the river, and there's a decent chance they're going to call us and we're going to win more money. So we actually do have the odds, essentially. We have the implied odds. Okay, so here's a similar scenario. So pretend the same thing happened, but this was the situation instead. In this case, I think we should definitely fold. So what changed was, instead of having 2 diamonds on the board and 2 diamonds in our hand, now there's 3 diamonds on the board and 1 diamond in our hand. So it's worse for many, many reasons. So one is when you only have 1 diamond in your hand and there's 3 diamonds on the board, if they have like ace king, it's going to be more obvious that we probably have a flush if we bet on the river and they have like ace king. So they're probably just going to fold ace king. So we're not going to get paid off when we hit the diamond. And even worse, we're not even drawing to the best hand. Like, what if they have ace king with the king of diamonds? Then we're just crushed. We're drawing dead in this situation. There's no cards that can help us win. So that's just such a huge risk. So yeah, and also a small thing, but the board is paired. So it's possible they have like pocket aces or ace 5. They already have a full house. And even if we hit the best flush, we're not going to win. Okay, so Okay, so that was a good example, I think, of when you have the implied odds to call with your draw to try to hit, when you don't have the implied odds to try to hit. But we can also bluff with draws. So in all the examples I gave you before where you check raise the flop, we had a good hand, right? But obviously this is predictable. If they know that we only check raise their flop bet with 2 pair or better, they can just fold whenever they have 1 pair or worse, right? So draws, not only are they good for implied odds purposes where you call and then only put in more money when you hit, they're also very good for bluffing in certain situations. So, essentially, what you'll realize is bluffing is sort of equivalent to having a draw in some sense. Because the hands you want to bluff with are the hands that have some draw value. So here's an example. The button raises to 1600. So we're 20 big blinds deep. And we're in the big blind with 10-9. And we call with our 4.5 to 1 odds. Okay, and the flop is Jack 10-5. So we've got what I would consider a good draw. So a good draw, I would say, usually means either an open-ended straight draw. So 4 in a row to a straight. So there's 8 potential cards that complete your straight. Or a flush draw, which usually has 9 outs. Okay, and then they bet 2,500. And then we go all in this situation. Essentially, we're bluffing. We're hoping they fold. But why is this a good play? So, it seems pretty sane to just call instead, right? Because we can call, we can have perfect information of when we hit, when we don't, and only risk more money if we do. But it's actually also quite a good play to go all in. Because, even though it looks like we have a bad hand to be risking all our chips, because we only have 10 high, the point is, the fact that we have 10 high doesn't matter. Because they're never calling our all-in with like a naked queen high or king high, right? They're not going to call with a random hand. So what matters isn't how good our hand is, in this case 10 high. What matters is how many outs we have against the hands that they call with. So in this case, we're always going to have 8 outs. Even if they have the best possible hand, like pocket jacks, we're still going to have 8 outs. So this is a great hand to bluff with, because if we call, we might just lose the pot to like queen high by the river. Whereas if we check raise all in, it's essentially the opposite of what I was talking about before with like being adversely selected. Here it's just essentially being beneficially selected, because all the hands that barely beat you, he's going to fold. And if they have a hand as good as when they have a hand as good as Jack, it's almost like wasted. They got their Jack with, if they had Jack, they're hoping we have like pocket 8s that only has 1 out against them. But here we have a much worse hand than pocket 8s with 8 outs against them. You can like contrast this with having, say, like 6-5 on the spot. 6-5 is a really bad hand to raise with. You just want to be calling because it's sort of the opposite. Any hand that beats you is going to be crushing you, and you're just going to fold out the hands that are already losing to your 6-5. So 6-5, if you're against like ace-jack, you only have 5 outs, and you have close to 0% equity against pocket jacks. So this is essentially the bluffing epiphany. So when you're bluffing before the river, the thing that matters isn't how good our hand is, it's how many outs we have. Okay, so this is essentially just me talking about the bluffing epiphany. So you want to always bluff with hands that have a high number of outs against the hands that you get called by. So here's an example of something that's not bluffing, okay? So the cutoff raises to 90, and we call with 7-6 of diamonds on the big blind. And this happens randomly. Sometimes you'll see someone make a play like works, and you're going to see someone make a play like this, and it's going to work, and they're going to look like a genius. So we check to the pre-flop raiser. We've got nothing, but we have a read that they like scratch their ear or something, so they're weak. So we check raise, hoping that they fold. So we get called, and we still got absolutely nothing here, and we bet on the turn because that's the only way we could potentially win the hand. And they call, and then we still have nothing. And as a last resort, we go all in on the river, and a good % of the time they're going to fold, and we're going to look like a genius for making this bluff, right? So basically this is not bluffing. This is essentially like opening your wallet and giving your money to your opponent. So when you're check raising, you essentially the reason why you were check raising in the first place as a bluff is because you had some chance of making a good hand, and essentially a bluff is because the hand that you could have potentially made, the flush that you potentially could have made, didn't get there. It's not because you started with a hand that could never make anything on this board and didn't get there. So okay. So here's a similar situation where I think it makes a lot more sense. So it's going to be a similar board, but we have 10-9 of hearts, and here we check raise their flop bet. So this situation is a bit different than the Jack-10 of diamonds situation from a while ago, where we only called with the flush draw. The reason why raising here is better is because the stack sizes is deeper. So with the Jack-10 of diamonds hand, the problem with check raising was there's a risk they would go all in and we would fold because we don't have good enough odds, yet our hand is so good. Here our hand is similarly good, but because it's so shallow, because it's so deep, so we actually started the hand with I think 100 big blinds instead of 40 big blinds. They're pretty unlikely to go all in. So here check raising 10-9 of hearts has a lot lower chance of getting blown off the hand. Okay, and we get called. And we turn a 15 out draw, so we had 9 outs here, right? But the Jack now essentially gives us 15 outs because it gives us the 8 open-ended straight outs plus the 9 flush outs minus the 2 from double counting, so 15 outs. And we bet 650 here, so it's the same hand as the 7-6 suited. It's the same hand as the stupid play. We're betting here, and we get called. So some notes, here our hand was good enough where, even though when we bet 650 into the pot on this turn, they could go all in. If they have like ace jack, they're probably going to go all in, and it's going to suck. But we have good enough odds in this case because we have so many outs that we can even call an all in. So it's fine. We can just call. And yeah, so note that by check raising the flop, betting turn. So the good thing about playing draws like this is that now if we play draws like this, we can also play our good hands like ace-8 or pocket deuces like this and get paid off a lot more. So okay, so we get called, and then the river is a king. It's not the scariest card, but we can have queen 10 of hearts. We could easily have queen 10 of hearts. So we go all in here, and even if the king wasn't scary at all, like even if the king was like a 3 or a deuce, I'm fine with just going all in because that's the only way we can win the hand. But it's a fine excuse here to go all in with 10 high on the river and say that's the only way I could have won the hand, because there was a reason I was check raising and representing all the strength on the flop and turn, right? It's because I had a heart draw. My heart draw didn't get there, so now I need to desperately to have a chance of winning the hand, go all in. But it's reasonable. The reason why I got to this situation, this bad situation, is because essentially I got unlucky, right? I had a chance of hitting a flush and I didn't. It's not like the 7-6 case where I knew I was going to get in this situation, which is not a good situation. But here I got a bit unlucky to get in this situation. Okay, so. All right, so I think this is the last example. So last example of when you give up on a bluff. So sometimes, you're bluffing, you don't have a great hand, but sometimes you just give up because you figure out your opponent's not folding, or like the board comes out in a way where it's not theoretically a good idea for your opponent to fold. So hijack -1 makes it 90, cutoff calls, and we're 100 bets deep. We call with Jack 9 of hearts from the big blind. Okay, so the flop is 10-7 deuce, and so we get a decent flop. So once again, we have a reasonable draw here. We have some reason to be bluffing. We don't have nothing. We have some reason to be bluffing because even though essentially we're hoping to turn 8, even though the chances of that is only 4 out of 47, which is low. But it's still something, and it's much better to bluff with a 4 out of 47 chance of making a monster hand than a 0 out of 47 chance. So, okay, so here, this was interesting. The pre-flop aggressor checked, which is fine. As the pre-flop aggressor, you're not forced to bet the flop. So, but note that the pre-flop aggressor is not the guy who bet the flop. So the cutoff bets the flop, but the cutoff was not the pre-flop aggressor. Okay, so the cutoff shouldn't have pocket aces. They could occasionally, but it's less likely than usual that they have pocket aces. So they bet, and we decide to check raise here. And yeah, I think this is a very reasonable play. So what are the reasons? One, so yeah, we have something we can try to turn an ace, and also turning a jack is fine. We could also turn a heart, and so we have lots of backdoor draws. We could turn a heart, that'll give us 4 hearts. We could turn even like a queen will give us an open-ended straight draw. A king will also give us an open-ended straight draw. So that's the weird case where, so if the turn is a king, then the board will be king 10-7, and we'll have jack 9, and then an 8 or a queen will give us a straight. It's one of the rare cases. It's called a double gut shot or a double gutter. So it's one of the strange cases to watch out for. It's possible to have an 8-out straight draw, even though you don't have 4 to a straight. So one example is where you have like, it's like this one, where you have a king and then jack to 9 and then 7. And another example is where, let's say you have like king jack on an ace 10 7 6 board, then essentially it's ace king blank jack 10 blank 8 7. So then you can have a hit a 9 or a queen. So there's a couple of weird straight draws you can have. But anyways, the point is, so yeah, I think this is a good play, not only because we have a crappy hand that's basically a crappy draw is a really good hand to bluff with, but also the fact that their range isn't particularly strong here because they can't really have aces. So they can have pocket 7s or pocket deuces, I guess, but also we're attacking the fact that he's not the pre-flop raiser, so their range isn't that strong. Okay, so hijack -1, the pre-flop aggressor gets out of the way, and then cutoff calls us. And then the turn is a 7, which is basically the worst card in the deck for us, I'd say, the 7 of clubs. Even if it was like the 7 of spades, it would have been better. So why is this the worst card? So first of all, it doesn't help us at all, right? It doesn't give us any kind of better straight draw or better flush draw or a pair. And furthermore, it's fairly safe. Even if the turn was an ace, we could at least pretend we have an ace. The 7 is a fairly safe card. If they have a pair of 10s, they're not jeopardized because an ace came. Furthermore, the main issue is his range is going to be a lot more likely to contain a 7 than our range. Because remember what I said earlier, you don't really want to be check raising the flop with your middle of the road hands. Because your middle of the road hands, you want to just call, because when you raise, you're getting called by you're getting called by better and you're folding out worse. So probably if I had a 7 on the flop here, I'm never check raising. So basically I can't have a 7 here. And furthermore, they're a lot more likely to have a 7. So this just really hurts us. Essentially, it's just a bad situation where their range is a lot stronger than our range. And basically the best thing we can do is just fold our hand. There's no point to try to continue bluffing. Like, it's sort of like playing the who's taller game where you don't get to see my height, but you know that I was like malnourished as a kid. Like, you just know, on average, there's no way I'm going to be taller than you. So the right thing to do here is to just stop or bluff. And it was like the worst card that came, but we just give up the hand, which is fine, and then they take down the pot. Right, so bluffing Epiphany 2 is basically, other than counting how many outs we have, it's important to analyze what we're representing. What else is in our range? We're bluffing, we don't have a good hand, but what's the good hand that we could potentially have in some other parallel universes that we're representing? And in this case, there just really isn't anything. So like an ace turn would have been fine. Even a 6 turn would have been okay because we could have represented 9-8. So one of the best times to bluff is when your draw missed, but a different draw completed. So like if you had a straight draw and you were bluffing the flop, and then the turn completes the flush, it's reasonable to bet. I mean, you do run into the risk that they have the flush, but also it's just they're going to be more scared of the flush. And similarly, yeah, like if you have a flush draw and the straight completes, you could also bet. Okay, so yeah, so ran through a lot of poker concepts today, so that's the end. I'll give a quick summary. So hopefully this will give people more ideas on how to play online. I know I sort of left you guys in the dark last time. I mean, I ran through things pretty quickly this time, but hopefully, you know, as you play more, it's okay if you didn't understand everything immediately, but hopefully as you play more, you'll be like, implied odds, or you'll be reminded of examples from this class. So yeah, so we covered continuation betting, the pre-flop aggressor, getting the respect, being able to bet, the fundamental theorem of poker about how you bet your good hands and bluff your bad hands. We analyzed different flops, and I tried to give you a general idea of what sorts of, how good your hand needs to be on certain kinds of flops. And yeah, so when I showed you the different flops, you know, what I told you, I didn't like mathematically prove that calling is good or raising is good. It's basically just like from experience and from doing calculations. I know roughly your equity is good enough, but I didn't like mathematically prove it. So you essentially just have to trust me in that sense for the example of flops that I showed you, because I didn't show any calculations. Yeah, we talked about when to lead, we talked about implied odds, reverse implied odds, set mining, bluffing withdraws, and then the two bluffing epiphanies. And yeah, so it's important to, so basically it's much easier to play good hands than bad hands in poker in some sense, because when you have a good hand, you just bet and hope your opponent calls. But it's important to know how to play bad hands, aka bluff, so that your opponent also might call you when you have a good hand. Because if you're the type of player who never bluffs, then the game is uninteresting, right? So, because then your opponent just always folds whenever you do anything. So that's why it's important to think about the bluffing epiphanies. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks. And hope you continue to play online.